Yeah, welcome to the third session of this AA11 lecture series titled The Ambivalence of Design. My name is Brendan Carlin. I'm organizing the event, workshops, and lectures along with Junsung and Jaewon Yi from Yonsei University. And the overall event is funded by the British Council. Today, we're very excited to welcome Olivia Neves Marra. She's an architect, researcher, and educator based in London, and she's currently teaching at the AA, directing a visiting school in Rio, the UCL Bartlett, Central St. Martin's, Leeds, number of places doing great work. Her work focuses on the relationship between ideological enclosures, ownership, and urban form. And she's completed a beautiful thesis titled The Garden as Political Form from Archetype to Project. Just on a personal note, she's been a very sharp and inspiring critic for our unit, and we always learn so much from her. So we're very excited to welcome her today. Thanks, Olivia.
Thank you so much, Brendan, for the kind introduction, and good morning, everyone. I'm truly honored. Is it all right, or should I? Here. I'm truly honored to be here. As Brendan mentioned, I am an admirer of your unit, Diploma 19. I've been a regular crit, and it's always a pleasure to come here for whatever reason, PNAPs and now this presentation, which I'm so happy to present for you and to join this fantastic lineup of speakers. What I'm about to present is a collection of notes that I've been gathering for a while. Many of the things that I will put on the screen were in the format of a footnote in my PhD thesis, and I'm now revisiting and trying to expand to hopefully transform it to a paper, or it will remain in the form of a lecture, perhaps. I don't know yet, but you will get a fresh view of what it's work in progress. So please make questions. I'm so looking forward to hear from you. I think that's also the nature of this symposium. And I'm also really, really glad that we have this amazing audience and participation from Yonsei students with us today. So as described, the title, we will look at the Coenobium, the Siedlung, and the Allotment as archetypes, or in other words, free experiments in dwelling and gardening, solitude and togetherness. Well, many of you might not be so familiar with these terms. So, of course, we will start with a brief introduction to these architectures in the lecture's argument. So I will explain what Coenobium means, Siedlung and Allotment mean as well. Then we will look at the Coenobium in the form of Charterhouse in Italy and England from the 12th century and the 14th century, when this archetype defined solitude as an ideology and togetherness as a project. Then in the third part of the lecture, I will argue the Siedlung, which is the German word for settlement, and I will argue it from the point of view of gardening as a mode of building and caring, which is basically the case of the projects by Lebrecht-Mige, concept of self-sufficient settlement in 1930s Germany. Then finally, we will finish with a session on English allotments, actually London allotments from the 1830s to present times. And I will argue how gardening has become a spatial praxis which could lead towards commoning. Again, tapping into the general theme of the symposium, perhaps amongst these three archetypes, the English allotments could be argued as the most ambivalent one. And so I hope that this session being the last, we can really discuss this, let's say, ambivalent character of architectural form. So, as promised, an introduction on the main argument of this lecture. So before I argue my idea on and my take on these three archetypes, I would like to briefly define Coenobium, Siedlung, and Allotment. So Coenobium is the Latin word for convent. It refers to a compound form where a limited group of individuals live in common. The word Siedlung or Siedlungen translates into English as settlements, meaning workers' housing projects. But in Germany, the word projects isn't as stigmatized as it is in the US. So it does refer to the settlement form. And the word allotment in English, British English, is the equivalent of the American term community gardens. But here, allotment refers to an area of land that had been privately enclosed and subdivided into garden lots to be let at low rates, mostly to workers, but nowadays to anyone who is willing to cultivate a plot. So the lecture proposes the Coenobium, the Siedlung, and the Allotment as three experiments in co-living for reconciling dwelling and gardening together, togetherness and solitude. So words that are simply not really, let's say, similarly together, or they don't usually go together, no? Togetherness and solitude. But I would argue that within these architectures, they do. And at the same time, the gardens found within these archetypes had disciplined monks, families, and workers. But gardening itself could have possibly liberated dwellers to focus on their lives as the core of their own practice by structuring that life according to self-chosen sets of rituals and shared rules. So by analyzing these three cases, or three archetypes, if you will, from the point of view of gardening, I hope we will find and we will understand the ambivalent spaces or the ambivalent characters of the Coenobium, the Siedlung, and the Allotment. Because despite having defined controversial agendas such as biopolitical projects of colonisation, which is the case of the Coenobium, domestication and urbanisation in the case of the allotments, these archetypes have also formalized gardening as a ritual of individual self-care and collective imagination. So we will therefore consider gardening not as a hobby, as it is commonly understood today, but as a mode of building and thinking, thus a praxis. That's what I mean by praxis, a mode of building and thinking. So what I would argue further is that these cultivated interiors inherently reconcile pragmatic concerns with uselessness and solitude and togetherness. So in this sense, we should reconsider Coenobium, Siedlung, and Allotment as ambivalent forms, which once reinterpreted can enable groups to find new ways of living together beyond the conventional modes of the nuclear family. And so it is precisely through this edge that I want to address the symposium's broader, the theme with ambivalence. No, it's and also that's also why I'm insisting on the term archetype, because the archetype, it's a form that of course defines a project, defines an experiment of co-living, but at the same time, it can possibly be reconsidered towards different projects. So this is what I hope we will arrive at the end. So with the Coenobium, I think that in order to understand this archetype, we need to first know a few things about early monasticism. So from an architectural point of view, Monasticism emerged as a housing question since early monks sought ways of living outside the status quo of settlements and early cities. So monastic life demanded self-will, diligence, and inwardness. So these efforts, or these virtues, if you will, required spaces where monks could separate themselves from the world to find their own rhythm. This was really key for early monasticism. So early monks had to walk away from non-monastic settlements or to walk away from the city, because those were places where nobody was ever alone, and everybody owned the community, their own work. So there was this really, relationship that if you wanted to live in a community, you would owe that community your work, no? And for monks, that exchange was not really possible because they had to find their own rhythm. They were in search for a form of life that was absolutely different from that. So monastic life required architecture to enable either total solitude or a fine balance between solitude and togetherness. So back then, in early monasticism, you would have two main approaches. One was the Hamites, and the other one, the Cenobites. No, both types branch out various forms of approaches found in most religions. But here we will focus on these two. So the Hamites were reclusive monks who chose to live completely alone. So complete seclusion. And most early Hamites lived in the Egyptian desert to escape the evils, what they call the evils of the world, hence the word hermits, which is Greek for desert dwellers. But hermits never formed communities in a strict sense, because each monk followed his own discipline, his own rhythm, as we have seen previously. Whereas the Cenobites were secluded groups of monks who chose to live together. So unlike the Hamites, the Cenobites are communal precisely because they share a set of rules, rituals, which included prayer, worship, study, work, and service. So here, the personal rhythm was not very much such a key thing as it was for the Hamites. So in this plan here, we see an early example of Coenobium in the 4th century Christian compound called Kelia Hermitage in Egypt. And this Coenobium is a cluster of cells around the central courtyard, as you can see here. No? Here, you cannot see my cursor, but that's fine. I think you can see it because the plan is really clear. It's really clear. So unlike the Hamites, who wanted to be alone all the time, the Cenobites strived for a balance between individual and collective life. But this balance could only be experienced through the sharing of rules and rituals, necessarily performed through a specific sequence of spaces. And after the 4th century, the Cenobitic rules and rituals were perfected by some of the most famous orders in Christianity, which were the Benedictine and the Cistercian. The Benedictine became quite famous for this plan over here, which is a model or scheme for an ideal monastery. It's known as Sangale scheme because it was found in the library of St. Gallen, and it's dated from the 9th century to prescribe every minute of the monks' lives. In the scheme, this is a close-up from a reconstruction I made a couple of years ago, but so it's very, it's oversimplified for a reason. Hopefully it will allow us to understand a few things about the scheme. So in the scheme, the cloister, as you see here in the center, works as a clock to lead monks from one ritual to another. And here architectural form, always follow function. From the close to the cell, nothing is left to chance. Everything was built in such a way for a reason. And not only specific moments, but all actions, even the simplest daily routines, were ritualized. And architecture was a crucial device to help the monks remember the sequence and the rhythm of those rituals. The same would happen in the Cistercian form of Cenobio, as you can see here in this plan, in the monastery of Clairvaux, founded in the 12th century in the countryside of Burgundy, and also in their monastery of Fontenay from the same period and region. In all these plans, it is interesting to note that there are no individual cells, but only collective dorms. So in fact, most of these Cenobitic monasteries will give more room to togetherness than to solitude, because to the Benedictines and the Cistercians, solitude was more temporal than spatial. This is really key. So monks would therefore spend a lot of time in silence, but in the physical presence of each other. Really beautiful, no? So I will quickly go through a different order, which is called the Carthusians. So the Carthusian order, however, had a different approach towards cenobitic life, as they believed solitude was formal and spatial, as it was ideological and spiritual. But the Carthusians didn't want to be totally alone, because they thought reclusion was a dangerous temptation. So they saw togetherness as a necessary remedy to be taken in small doses. They were really cautious about it, if not skeptical. So around the 10th century in Western Europe, there were, the idea of solitary togetherness, was quite new, and there were no architectural precedents for that, except this commune in Camaldoli in Arezzo. However, this was not really a cenobium. This was more like a colony of hermits. They were living, here, but in their own way. They would never really meet up and come together. So it is quite possible, since there was no precedent for that, no architectural precedent for those kind of spaces, it's quite possible that the Carthusians knew or model the idea of compounds in the ancient Roman domus, which we can see a famous example here with the House of Faun in Pompeii. And as you can see in the schemes, the archetypal Charterhouse is defined by a row of secluded cells bound to a central void. So, of course, it's not identical to the Roman domus, but it's visibly similar, or we might use the term, it is analogous. We can say these are analogous forms. So the two main functions of this configuration were, first, to limit the number of monks living together, hence the courtyard, to gird the ring of cells around it. And second, to emphasize the primacy of individual rhythms over collective rituals. And by the time, we really need to have this in mind, by that time, people rarely lived alone, since they had to belong to a group and behave under the pressure of the collective body. And in most medieval cities, like Rome over here, housing tended to be clustered around palazzos, churches, fortresses, and other institutional buildings. So due to safety reasons and also customs that dated back centuries, people will always walk in groups. even there were a lot of sects in Rome at the time, for instance. So walking in group was really a necessity. And even in their everyday activities, they were never alone. Also at home, people used to sleep together with several people. There were no individual bedrooms, for instance. So these customs started to change in around the 11th and 12th century with something that historians call the discovery of the individual. And this was due to a radical transformation of Western mentalities caused by a complexity of economic and social changes that, of course, we won't have time to go into details, but you're probably acquainted with this world history. And amongst the social and economic changes, we had the decline of the Byzantine power, which put ultimately Christendom in crisis as it split between West and East. So in northern Italy, a growth of urban populations gave rise to early organized capitalism and commercialized culture. And artisans started to emancipate themselves from religious and monarchic organizations, and work of arts became secular commodities. This you might also know from your history course. This moment was really, really crucial. Also reflected on several changes in urban form and so on. So on these lines, people started to recognize themselves as individuals, either in relation to the world or to God, but not necessarily in relation to communities. So this was a really great shift in history. So the 12th century discovery or rise of the individual was not about individuality. It was about interiority. So it's not really individuality as we know, not even the concept of individual as we know now. It was different. It was about interiority. So it is in that sense that the monastic ideology really tap into, because the Carthusian order was at the avant-garde of that mentality. So their monasteries defined solitude by associating interiority with the single body and the single body with the space of the cell. So a typical Carthusian cell was thus a micro-dwelling equipped with the basics for solitary living. And this included a hidden anteroom or chamber, a cubiculum with 4 foldable pieces of furniture, bed, bench, table, and bookcase, a small chamber, a corridor leading to a ladder, and a latrine at the rear. So the cell form was minimal and austere, but its spatial arrangements enabled the monk to live according to his own rhythm. And even though this life was totally bound to a cell, so he would live his entire life in that cell and would only leave it once a week. So it was really radical. No? So even though his life was totally bound to the cell, it was a fundamental liberation from the idea of family, husbandry, and other social structures that were very repressive towards individual life. So the cell was a frame or framework for a constantly evolving life experiment, because the monks didn't really know how to live like that. So they were also, there were rules, of course, but they were experimenting with those rules and try to find a way to live in that let's say, in that state. So this experiment would find its fulcrum in the covered portico and garden, as you can see here, highlighted in blue, where the monk could meditate and cultivate vegetables and herbs for himself. And although it was 3 times the size of the cell itself. The garden was more about self-care than self-sufficiency. And gardening was not, gardening for the Carthusians actually was like a lifestyle, no? And it would make their lives not only more bearable, but also very much experimental. Yet Carthusian monks had to work only for themselves. They could not work for the monastery. So they were not gardening for the other monks, no? So, of course, within that small space, they were not able to produce everything they needed, no? But that was okay. The compound was prepared for that. So they had lay brothers producing bread and other things, and everything the monks could not produce by themselves within their cell would be delivered by a lay brother through this slit over here, highlighted in blue. And in fact, monks could only leave their cells to meet at the cloister only 1 hour a week. And at the center of the cloister, there was not a garden, but a garth, which was minimally planted with a single pine or a juniper. And the emptiness of that garth aimed at making the center visible from the cloister arcades, as to remind the monks they lived in solitary togetherness. So they could somehow see each other, but not truly be together. So within that scheme, individual and collective lives were juxtaposed without ever being merged. And moreover, the cloister, it shielded the monks from the world, including the rest of the Coenobium. So by Coenobium, again, remind you, I'm talking about the entire compound. It only gave a small way to other collective facilities. Here below, what is highlighted in blue, there's another cluster here that I mentioned before, where the lay brothers would produce bread and so on, and would also meet with local authorities. And because the lay brothers were basically managing the entire compound here in this cluster, the monks could just concentrate and being with themselves inside the cells, away from the world. And as this separate cluster shielded the monks from mundane affairs, it allowed the Carthusians to establish their Coenobiums almost everywhere. So from the countryside, like this one, the Charterhouse in Florence, or major medieval cities, as in the case of the famous London Charterhouse, which you can still find it incrusted in Islington, near Angel Station. So even though the Carthusians opposed the status quo of private property, their model of Coenobium seems a bit paradoxical, because the Charterhouse, such as this one, produced biopolitical housing states of individual cells around exclusive courtyards. So in a way, it kind of it controlled the lives of the monks within those states. And that is why they would later serve as archetypes for modernist ideas of housing, precisely because they were quite biopolitical spaces. And as you may know very well, in the 1922, Le Corbusier modeled this idea of immobile ville upon his sketches of the Charterhouse in Florence, when he went on a trip in 1907. And the formal associations and similarities with the Carthusian Coenobium are evident, as all housing units cluster together around a central empty court. So again, these are analogous forms, no? Not identical, but we can certainly argue them as analogous. And the flats also are quite similar to the monk cells insofar they aim at providing inhabitants with all essential facilities for dwelling, from a tiny personal study room to a vegetable garden. So both to the Cartesians and to Le Corbusier's idea of apartment, the issues of comfort, hygiene, productivity, interiority, social control are central to the idea of dwelling. And so in this sense, one may argue that the Coenobium and the urban apartment block are driven by a biopolitical logic of housing and organizing groups of individuals, because this architecture confines everyday activities into a totalizing scheme of spaces. And so even though Cartesian monks were keen on seeing themselves as single individuals, Le Corbusier overlooked this crucial fact to reinvent the cell as a new form of nuclear family house. So this is when we can see the archetype is reinterpreted. No? So there is a nuance there. They're similar, we can say they're analogous, but of course, here we are in the early 20th century circumstances, and so we have an architect that has a take on a nation form, let's say, and a medieval form, and reinterpret it towards a different aim, let's say. So moreover, here we see the facades of those individual gardens. The stacking of units would further individualize those nuclear families by detaching their apartments from the whole block and its cloister-like court. So thanks to this verticalization, this court loses its archetypal character, and is no longer, let's say, it no longer render the housing units as a collective body. So on the same logic, the unit garden help the facade to participate in the green embellishment of the street. So everything becomes more vertical at this point. And for most, the gardens appeared on the street or to the street to represent the status quo of private property, because of course the gardens would mark very visibly, these units. And of course, each unit was a flat that was property to a nuclear family. So here we go, a modern project very much representing private property. Le Corbusier further confirms this prototype of the singular unit in the form of the pavilion, l'Esprit Nouveau, in 1925. And here, the nuclear family house is also individualized, alienated, and detached. So this detachment was not because this was meant to be a pavilion. No, there was a lot more to it. The detachment was important because it aimed to prescribe dwelling as something completely bound to architecture and property, and in total separation from the city and its collective life. Okay, I just realized I'm going a little bit slower than I wanted. We are half an hour through right now. It's Monday, it's raining, and it's morning, early morning. How are you? Would you like a break? Would you like to pose questions? No? Can we just continue? Okay, so we are basically halfway through the lecture, but of course this second half now, it's a bit faster, it's not that long. However, it might seem a little bit more like dense and compressed. So if you need a break at some point, please let me know. I might need it to drink something. Yes, please. Yes.
It's a very quick question, but the cells that the monks lived in, you said obviously people would have to bring the things that they couldn't provide for themselves, like the bread. Did they interact with these people when that happened? No. Okay.
Yes, no. They were not allowed to interact with the lay brothers. So the lay brothers, they were not exactly monks. They were part of the order. They were very important. They lived there in the compound. They were allowed to leave, but only to do their affairs. So they could leave the compound for a while. As opposed to the monks that were not allowed to leave the upper cluster within the compound. Yeah, so they couldn't speak to each other. So even when they would go to the church, for instance, to pray, the plan of the church would separate the monks from the lay brothers. And of course, the lay brothers were bigger in number than the monks. So as we saw, these plans, they were very careful in limiting the number of monks living there. So usually 10 to 12, more or less. The typical charter house would house 12 monks. And the lay brothers were many. Apparently no limitations there either, So yes, great question. I mean, we can later, if you want. I mean, the lecture goes through these 3 archetypes. But if you are more interested in one, we can just go back there and dissect it, whatever you want to. I mean, I think it always works best when you lead the discussion later. Okay, let's continue. So, as we saw now, we could say that Le Corbusier anticipated a series of housing experiments that proliferated around Germany after the First World War. No, that's obvious. No, it's not what we can say it, but I would say he anticipated it in a very particular way. Because now, as I said, we will look at the archetype of the settlement from the vantage point of gardening. So it's an analysis that hopefully you haven't seen around in your history books so much. So and through the point of view of gardening, I would argue the settlement as a place where familial gardening has become somehow, or could become, a mode of building and caring, which is the case of Lebrecht Mige's self-sufficient settlements. So we will look at 3 decades in his career here. So one of the examples of dwelling that Le Corbusier have anticipated was the villa. The detached, the new take on the detached villa, as we can see here in Ernest May's project that he designed for himself and his family of wife and 2 children just outside Frankfurt in 1928. And the similarities with Le Corbusier's villas are obvious, but we couldn't call May's house an experiment per se if it wasn't for its emphasis on an emerging concept at the time, which was the modern rational landscape. And Ernest May designed the gardens in collaboration with Lebrecht Mige, who was promoting an quite architectonic understanding and utilitarian view of gardening at the time. And unlike his other collaborators, such as Bruno Taut, Otto Wagner, and Adolf Loos, Mige, who was friends with Ernest May, had a left-wing agenda with the concept of self-sufficient settlements, the so-called Siedlung. Actually, here we can see Mige housing the garden of one of his projects, Homstadt Siedlung in Frankfurt. But Mige stood out more because he coupled the settlement planning with biological functionalism, focused on the unicity between dwelling and gardening, which in his view would produce a metabolical cycle of life. So this is one of the pamphlets in which he would promote this idea of garden and house together as the framework of a metabolic cycle. And the fulcrum of that metabolism, if you will, was the utility garden, a combination of open air rooms and house interiors, which made the whole unit self-sufficient. And within those models, Miguel would also design even the smallest of details. So he would design the system of trash bins and everything that was entailed in maintenance was carefully designed here. So it was not just an idea. He actually thought it through in very architectural terms. The plan integrated the kitchen with a glass house terrace to form a sort of threshold where waste was turned into compost and fuel. And through that threshold, house and garden interpenetrated each other like the two metabolic phases needed to keep an organism alive. And in the same way that a garden grew, but sometimes needed replanting, the house itself was seen as something that could grow or diminish according to the dweller's needs. And as it happens in the Cartesian Coenobium, Miguel's concept of self-sufficient settlement was an architectural question essentially defined in reaction to the city. So again, we can see similarities, we can see things that are analogous. This idea that the single housing unit could enable a whole life within itself, no? Again, not exactly like in the Cartesian monastery, but very much analogous, I would say. Nonetheless, Miguel called for a new urbanity. So even though he was opposed to the city, he was not actually opposed to an idea of urban living. He only, but he would only propose that that urbanity should be different. So, he called for that urbanity rather than a reactionary return to a peasant way of life. So it was, he was talking about gardening, he was talking about self-cultivation, but he was not really nostalgic. He was not saying that people should, again, live like peasants. The aim was to enable urban subjects to live and work autonomously outside major urban centers. So it is important to know that Miguel's idea of resettlement was against the Nazi rhetoric of blood and soil and had nothing to do with their politics of internal colonization. I mean, it's an important footnote. However, after the First World War, the conservative mayor of Frankfurt employed the Siedlung idea as a strategy to move workers away from the city and so away from workers' unions. So here we understand why Miguel, a leftist thinker and architect, was involved in these projects of resettlements, no? Because this idea of living away from city center fitted quite well the conservative agenda of the mayor to push the working class away from the unions. So, that's why, that's when these projects start to get very controversial. But to Miguel, Ernest May and their leftist circle, these self-sufficient settlements would emancipate workers instead of alienating them. Here, ambivalent, no? Very much ambivalent. So it's still, the idea of settlement served both progressive and conservative agendas because it conceives the house as the starting point for reproducing an entire territory. Thus, unit extensions could reconfigure the entire settlement and eventually its collective life. And on the same logic, the single cultivations of several vegetable gardens could lead up to a system of landscape managed on a regional scale. So from the house to the territory. And as you might be wondering by now, after seeing that scheme here, you might be thinking, okay, well, these projects were also profoundly influenced by E. Howard's concept of garden city. Yes, of course, they were. In fact, in Howard's garden cities, he would have an allotment belt encircling the housing districts. But it is really important to say that Migue's projects went further, and we cannot even, include them in the garden city sort of movement, if you want to call it movement. We cannot really say that Migue was part of that trajectory. Because he went much further, connecting gardening and dwelling both spatially and conceptually. So it was not so much, it was not only at a scheme level, but very much at an architectural, from an architectural form sort of scale. But the weakest point of the settlement idea was the kitchen, which Ernest May once described as an efficient kitchen by a woman for women. Yes, that's the problem. That's always the problem. So I'm not sure if Migue would agree with that, I am about to say, but if the kitchen was the place of the mother, we can assume the vegetable garden was the space of the father, because at the time, gardening was still seen as something quite masculine. But in any case, this passive embrace of the gender-defined housework was surely the greatest contradiction in all Siedlung projects. So even though these architects were in fact progressive in proposing land reform as a housing experiment, they didn't go as far as to rethink dwelling beyond the nuclear family prerogative. And that was already questioned by Karel Teige, for instance, with his theories on the potential of minimum dwelling as a form of living against traditional forms of domesticity. And one of the most important critiques of the Siedlung by Ernest May and Lebrecht Migue came in one of his books, which is this one here, about the minimum dwelling, publishing 1932. And Teige was particularly keen on attacking May and Migue for the Siedlung projects, which in his view embody the institution of marriage and family-based households. So this is one of the pictures of Migue in his Sun Pavilion for this Home and Soil exhibition of 1925. And this is him with his wife and child. So even though he was quite progressive in some ways, he was not as critical when it comes to the bourgeois idea of the nuclear family. And so, as an alternative, his main critic, Karel Teige, offered his famous diagram suggesting the minimal dwelling could be a form of domestic space organized around two poles, the individual cell and the collective facilities. And although Teige was correct in his criticism, one may argue that was a bit dismissive of Migue's idea of gardening, because as you can see here, sorry, you might not be able to see it but I can explain. But as you can see here in his diagram, you have the individual living self apart from all the other collective spaces, and also shared facilities. But in the diagram, you don't see something like a courtyard or a garden, or even a space where people could grow anything. So the question of self-sufficiency and the question of gardening as a collective ritual was not really present in Karel Teige alternative for housing. So again, he was very important and a really key critic of the Siedlung idea. However, his theories weren't complete, let's say, either. He himself could also be target of our own criticism, no? And I think, because contrary to Ernest May gender-based kitchen, Migue's idea of functional garden was the space where the dwelling could be transformed both in size and in form. So it could open up for the whole settlement to be, in a way, transformed by its residents. And these processes will happen mainly through gardening as a mode of building and caring, not only in the sense of everyday maintenance and self-help, but also the assembly of spaces to support the shared practice of new rules, rituals, and alternative forms of collective dwelling. So through these gardens, perhaps people could get together and decide if they would transform these plots. So in other words, gardening could become the nexus between individual and collective lives. And this potential was also present in Migue's projects of large public parks, such as this one, which included an allotment garden here on the bottom right. So, with this, Miguel wasn't calling for a return to wilderness, but a particular kind of landscape for public use. And so by proposing the allotments in a public garden, Miguel believed that that individual vegetable gardening was a form of active solitude. So people could actually go to the park and not only see other people and be seen and behave like they would in a typical public park, but they could also do other things. So in this sense, the work by Lebrecht Miguel takes us back to the Cartesian take on solitude as a life experiment, which is both a product and a transformative agent of togetherness. So almost 100 years after Miguel's self-sufficient settlement, we can use this concept to rethink solitude as a spatial component of interpersonal communication. We should take solitary togetherness as a generic condition for which individuals may recognize themselves as part of larger groups, such as associations and housing cooperatives. Okay, so now is the final session of the lecture, which might take like 15 minutes, I would say. Do you want a break? No? Are we cool? Okay, Brandon is back, so that's great. Okay. Okay, cool. Right, so yes, please.
Thanks. No, it's more of a question of representation and the representation of the project. Is it the Stahnsdorf Siedlung? I can't remember. But it's interesting to me why Miguel decides to represent this idea of gardening through like a really rigorous repetition of identical gardening units. If to me, gardening is about kind of a varied, diverse difference within this like more rigid architectonic framework, but he decides to render the gardening with the same hardcore repetition as the building themselves. And I just wonder why he decides to do that if he's trying to promote this idea of individuality, like through this collectivity, that like the collectivity is represented and expressed through the structure of the building itself. However, the gardens don't, to me, seem to represent that individuality either through their representation.
Yeah, great question. You might, I think the third part of the lecture will be very interesting to you because it touches on that greatly. I think that Miguel was, I mean, we have to have in mind, take into account the context, his context in the post-war, and also he studied at the Bauhaus, and so there was, I think, this this mentality, and this urgency in thinking about mass production in architecture, standardized. So, and also have in mind that at that time, gardening was still understood as something quite traditional and empirical, and like something very much linked to familial traditions. And I think that his take, his approach to the garden, as well as the way he represented it, was very much concerned in saying, no, look, this is an architecture. This is, this is as these elements, this space is as architectural as the kitchen. And if we are saying that the kitchen should be standardized and should be mechanized, so should be the garden. So he was very, of course, as a gardener himself, he knew that a lot of gardening is empirical, and it will always be empirical. It is really its nature, in a way. But he really needed to reconceptualize that space in these senses, because he was actually saying, "Oh, look, every house unit should have a space for cultivation, because that's how people will can potentially become self-sufficient, and then they can live more cheaply. They can also be self-reliant." So I think this ideology required the garden to be presented in a different way. In a way that was not the traditional, cozy, almost kitschy-like sort of, ritual, if you will, where, roses would be cultivated out of passion, Of course, all that would happen still within that modern garden. But the concept of utilitarian, self-sufficient garden was more important for him. Yeah. My response was dangling because I was thinking about it now, and it's a great question. Yes, great. Thank you. Okay, so let's, yes.
I have one question from Zoom.
Yes. Hello.
Yes. Hello. My name is Jaewon, and organize this workshop together. And I have a very key question and Miguel's project in the drawing. All gardening seems to belong to only single families. So I think, is there any chance to share or gardening together in the village or some part of area?
Yes, this is what I wonder as well. And but as far as I'm aware, he never mentioned that possibility in his projects. But we now, looking back, by looking at these schemes, and also the very idea of the unit, the housing unit itself, I think we could certainly see the potential. But I guess that, I assume that in the context of Neue Frankfurt, for instance, those projects of rehousing, resettling, if he said that people could share the open space in their plot, and maybe tear down these fences and walls in between private plots. I guess that if Miguel said something, those terms at that time, he would be immediately taken as a communist, not even a socialist, but a communist, because of course that would challenge private property. And I guess that within the context of his service to the municipality of Frankfurt, for instance, if he wanted to do that, maybe he would, I don't know, but if he wanted to do so, he would surely not be allowed. So, in these resettlement schemes, these were, of course, welfare projects, but they didn't go as far as to challenge the status quo of private property. And again, the nuclear family as something that would, as a model that would be very much tied and legitimating that idea of private property. So it's an excellent question, and I think it's a question that would enable us now, architects, students, researchers, to take a look back at these projects and see how what we could do with them.
Right.
Wonderful. Thank you. Okay, shall we head to the end, and then we can have a longer conversation if you want. So in the last session, I will argue the English gardens as frameworks for cooperative gardening towards commoning. So again, this is not this is my take or perhaps wish. This argument is somewhat visible in these cases that we are about to see, but they are never really obvious. So it requires us to reflect a bit together. So allotment gardening could be taken as a stepping stone, so for associations of people to start doing things in common, overcoming the rising cost of living in London. So very much a question that is super urgent nowadays as well. So first of all, let's understand what is an allotment. Not everybody knows, it's a very English thing. So a typical allotment site is like this one. It's an enclosed land owned either by a private landlord or a charity or a local authority, such as a borough council. And in any case, the space is legally held for public use for the purpose of small-scale horticultural gardening. So it should be done by hand, never with machines. And upon popular demand, the owners have the duty to lease the land to a garden association, which in turn manages and subdivides the site into unfenced plots. So you can see their subdivisions, but they are always unfenced and not walled, of course. The association lets the plots at low rates to local inhabitants who queue on long waiting lists. And tenants can lay out and cultivate their plots however they want. And they can do it, they can do anything in their plot as long as they don't breach the rules established by the association. And it's important to understand that each garden association have their own rules. It can vary greatly between one allotment to the other. And these terms, the relationship between the plot keepers and the garden association is ruled by terms that date back from 1922, when Parliament issued an act regulating allotments as a type of small landhold. So from a legal point of view, this archetype presupposes the condition of private property. So it's something that since the beginning English landowners and members of parliament and also philanthropists, they have always seen the allotment as something that existed within the realm of private property. It was considered a form of welfare, a form of aiding the workers, but it was not considered a charity, and it was very much considered a type of landhold. This is important to remember. However, both to popular imagination and to leftist thinkers, allotments are emblems of social struggle, activism, collectivism, collectiveness, and counterculture, which is the case of the famous book, The Allotment, written by anarchist thinkers David Crouch and Colin Ward. And you know these thinkers, they are quite famous, and they have always been friends with English architect Walter Siegel, and they share an interest with self-building, with anarchism, and the role of architecture and enabling people to live alternatively. So there is, of course, this ethos, but I will not go into this today. But we can say that it is true. It is very much a thing for leftist thinkers, the allotment. It is not by chance that former Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn always speaks of his own plot when he needs to portray himself as a legit representative of the working class. He always says, my plot, he has a plot on the north of the city in East Finchley. But nowadays, this perception of allotment gardening is changing, since many people just want to cultivate a plot as a healthy and an environment-friendly activity, and also a hobby. So it's a complex thing. And as a result of that, the bulk of 120 sites in London today cannot cater to the increasing demand of plots, demand for plots, sorry. Meanwhile, many sites are disappearing due to real estate pressure. So we can see here the boroughs of Bromley, for instance, still have lots of allotments, whereas the inner boroughs in London don't have many, or sometimes don't have any allotments anymore, of course, because the land within inner London is much more valuable. So the more valuable the land in a borough, the less allotment sites you will find there. So that's why here with the tightest hatch, you can see here, these are the boroughs with the higher concentration of allotments, and not coincidentally, they are still affordable. They're still affordable places to live. So moreover, because allotment gardening has ultimately become an ultra-commodified and individualized hobby, associations are struggling to legitimize the need to protect these places. As a result, many local authorities are allowing landowners to sell parts of their sites to either private or public developments. And it is interesting to know that the allotment archetype had historically contributed to its own tragic fate. And here's the ambivalent character of this type. Because we can understand how this happened with the oldest living example in London, for instance, Ely Common Allotment Garden, which is one of the key case studies we will see now. So the site sits on a common land. It's been an ancient common land in the west of the city. And it had been enclosed and appropriated by the Bishop of London around 1820s, more or less. And in 1832, the bishop decided to lease the land for the parish of Ealing to let out garden plots to families of working parishioners. And meanwhile, Ealing went from a village, as you can see here, to eventually a town. So as the bishop let his the land to the parish, and the parish leased this land to parishioners to grow gardens within that enclosure, the city around also suffer a similar process of subdivision. So the allotment, in a way, anticipated the urbanization of the surroundings, both spatially and culturally, and also legally, in a way. So the site has set up the same logic of reparcellization from the moment it had been privatized and enclosed and subdivided to its cultivation and social practice. And initially, the parish established rules to educate its families with evangelical principles, such as individual self-help, sobriety, Sunday worship, and respect for private property. And as these rules also demanded a tidy and productive gardening, they kept the families busy and confined to their own plots. So since caring for the plots was such a laborious and moralizing activity, the site had a masculine character, which only reinforced the primacy of paternalism over social change, self-help over collective benefit, and individuation over togetherness. However, allotments were very ambivalent, which there were ambivalent spaces and ambivalent frameworks, if you will, as they opened room for counter projects. And this was the case of the Cumberland Garden allotments, which still resists massive real estate pressure to this day, and it sits squeezed in between Euston Station and Regent's Park. So you can see here, it's an old map, but you can still recognize Regent's Park on the right, and Euston Station, not as big as it is now, but you can see here the station on the left, and here in blue is the canal. And the allotment was built on top of the canal. So what happens is that the site was formed during the Second World War, when residents got together to reclaim their rights to use the landfill of the formal basin that ended the canal right there. And after several years of struggle against the Crown State, which owned the land, the group eventually got a long-term lease and started building a garden over the landfill. And as a result, this allotment, it is very small, untypically small, I'd say, and is also nested within these housing buildings, which are all for low-income families. These buildings here, for instance, are owned and led by the Peabody Trust. So it has always been a place for working class families. But this situation of having such an urban allotment within the center of London, also close to a very posh area, is very unusual. And in a way, it's interesting because the site resembles Coenobium, both in scale and form. However, in practice, it could really become the open blueprint for self-sufficient settlement. So it's an interesting case that somehow alludes to the other architectures that we have just seen. And drawing from its own past, allotment gardening could become the nexus between active solitude and togetherness. Most and foremost, because these places already have all the spatial ingredients for groups of plot holders to start thinking and doing things in common. Hence, they could become spaces for commoning. And so we came finally to the last slide, and I just brought these points. These are the three stages necessary for commoning to basically happen. These are proposed by the political thinker Massimo De Angelis in his book Principles for the Transition to Post-Capitalist Societies. And he basically outlines these three stages as the sharing of material and immaterial resources, organization and association of people willing to share, and thinking and doing things in common. So basically, through these stages, Massimo De Angelis defines commoning not as a natural phenomenon that may happen, out of the blue, but really as a system that is built up through a series of stages and phases of gathering of materials, organizations, and so on. And so, as we've seen, even though the allotment is quite an ambivalent space where you would see domestication happening, also discipline, a place for disciplining the users, disciplining workers, taming workers in a way. They could also be the spaces where people could self-organize in this way as a means to overcome the pressures of a capitalist system, the pressures of producing for earning money, having to be productive subjects in order to live. So in this way, in these spaces, perhaps people could try, even though they are working on land that is privately owned, for instance, they could use the allotment as an institutional framework to perhaps think about their lives as a counter project to overcome those conditions. Yeah, so this is what I am about to say. Sorry, I aimed at giving a lecture that was much lighter and faster, but it turns out that when we talk, we always add things, and it's fine. I hope it wasn't so exhausting and to hear me speak. But now I would very much like to hear from you if you have questions or observations about these cases. I presented to you my take on them and my observations in the light of the theme proposed by the symposium. But of course, I would very much like to hear your thoughts as well, or questions, or whatever you want to put in front. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Olivia. I think that everything you've shared is very useful to us to kind of understand these things in depth, but also to start a conversation. This is also relating a lot to our unit work, so it's very interesting to see and share. I just wanted to mention for anyone online that has questions, you can also drop them in the chat, and if not, we can start maybe with some questions in the room. Okay, Daniel.
Hi, thank you for the sharing. I may have two questions. Like the first one is, you shared a drawing which is about good government, which runs like the 12th century. I mean, how to define that good government? Is that because like the individuality is becoming more? I mean, the common, like people studying have like the individuality and the identities. Is that the reason they become the good government at that time?
Interesting. Well, that would be a lot of food for thought and maybe hours of conversation. But no, I selected that picture for that particular slide because it shows a medieval city. It's very, in a way, accurate in the way it depicts, even though it's an allegory of good government, as we know. It just shows a typical medieval center at that time, where people would, where the question of the individual was gradually emerging. But I didn't have any intentions in connecting with the allegory and what the allegory says. Now I want to think about it, of course, but I don't think. Well, maybe the slide was a bit misleading. Perhaps I should have. Perhaps I should have selected another picture to illustrate the slide, but it doesn't connect with the work by Ambrosio.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. It's really clear and nice on every aspect. But one aspect I'd like to sort of unravel is a common theme was that the garden allowed for self-sufficiency and therefore sort of power to the individual. But as you see today in London, I'm sure even Jeremy Corbyn would buy vegetables at Tesco from time to time. And it's not really, even in terms of the cost of it, it's probably cheaper to buy your vegetables at a supermarket than it is to buy the soil and the tools you need for your own allotment. So from that point of view, it's not empowering either. So I was wondering if you've ever thought about the current day equivalent of the garden in terms of something that gives power to the individual within the state system. Perhaps like solar panels as an example, where you can provide for your own electricity or something like that.
A crucial question. I guess that's why I put the slide about commoning at the end, because I think if we want to see gardening as a mode of building, as something that might enable self-sufficiency, also cooperation amongst people, we need to see it first outside the framework of private property. So we shouldn't be talking about backyards. Right? We need to think about, the park, the common, also idle land, or maybe courtyards that become connected because people decide to, get rid of fences and walls. So it is a question of scale, of course. It is a question of finding an alternative or maybe challenge the status quo of private property. And it's also a matter of how space is then, organized. So it is an architectural question. And the other thing that's why also the settlements, the growing settlements, the Siedlungs are here as well, to suggest that if we want to think about gardening as a means to self-sufficiency, we also need to think about, a network of gardening in the city. So, of course, not even a very big productive allotment can really provide the necessary intake for the gardeners. It just can't. Actually, I haven't mentioned it, but it is meant as a type of landhold in England. It has been regulated in such way to prevent people to grow everything they need. So the size of the plot and also the rules, you should garden by hand. You need to come here with your family, don't bring your friends. all these rules, they are meant to basically keep that kind of gardening as an activity that is relaxing, is about self-care, and all of that is very positive, and all of that we need. But then again, it prevents revolution. It prevents people to basically break the mode of of buying food from the supermarket. And also it prevents people from actually saying, no, look, we will take this land to stop buying food, to live in a way that is not prescribed. So yes, it is a type that throughout its history has prevented people to take it further, or to basically transform it. So that's why I think that also Migi is very interesting, because he was talking about the efficiency, but not in a reactionary way, but in a way that could emancipate workers to live more cheaply and to not rely on consumerism and so on and so forth. So I think if you are to think of a project with gardening in London, for instance, or in any other city, you have to think about networks. So if it's impossible to, for instance, have a very large piece of land where groups of people can organize and cultivate, you could think about the territory, how clusters of gardens could connect to each other, maybe through internet, and then exchange produce, for instance, instead of buying from one another, and so on. So yeah, it's a very complex question, and that's why I think it should be seen for once and for all as an architectural question, not something that lies outside or beside architecture.
I would actually want to develop on that. I think it's a very interesting question. You were mentioning in the beginning the idea of the monk cells and how it was a forced individualization to kind of live there. And I feel like I'm going to do this comparison with the pandemic, where we were kind of forced into a similar kind of modes of living. And it's just when we figured out how much we were reliant on what Logan was saying, the supermarkets being open, having the kind of products that we're used to, and also digitalization, I think, had a lot to do with this. So I feel like in the past years, there has been a focus on the importance of having a little balcony, a garden, and there was also a huge rural movement from people that were living in the center of London, for example, to taking property exactly for this idea of having a garden that they could actually sustain themselves with. So in kind of this changing world, what do you think that the role of the architect becomes?
Yeah, it's a pretty difficult question. It's I think the architect, the role of the architect. Yeah, I think a good way would be to try to experience, these things. It's not the only way, but I think it's a good way to start. So, for instance, have we ever tried to organize or even rebuild a space, an open space, just using soil, vegetables, roots? Have you ever tried? I mean, this could be a really nice experiment to challenge the way we always think about space, to challenge the way we design. I'm not saying that designing through drawing or other means of making is wrong. I'll never say that anything's wrong. It's just that we could add we could try to imagine other ways through which we could think about space, and we could conceive space. So I don't have an answer for the role of the architect. I must say, maybe I'm still very young to have an answer for that. I still need to work a lot in order to have the experience to answer to this question. But I do think that if we change the way we look at, for instance, gardening, and also the way we understand building, what building can be and what it means, then we can start to rethink, or to think about architectural practice, not only from, the vantage point that we have been, educated to consider, but also other ways, I think maybe that's the direction.
Just following Logan's question. I mean, I really like your explanation about that question, and I also feel like self-producing is a good way against consumerism. But I just want to ask, because the Allotment, is, for example, the example you shown is beside a social housing, right? And the people who rent the social housing usually have the low income, at least it's not that high. And in that case, the money you could save by self-producing, for example, if we grow the blueberry in the garden, and it can save probably £1 or £2 from buying from the Tesco. But if we save that time to, let's say, go out to work, we might produce more incoming, do you think? And so in this case, do you think the gardening is more a recommendation of the lifestyle, or it's more a way against the consumerism? I'm not quite sure if I explained my question clearly.
Yes, thank you. I also think it connects with his question. I think it can be something more structural than escaping, the consumerism or whatever. I think it can be something far more, I would say, structural than that. So I think it's more, it's not a matter of lifestyle in the sense of hobby or even these things that people immediately connect with whenever we talk about gardening or green matters, such as biophilia. I think, it can be, but I think all these things are very superficial. Okay, I'm not saying that I appreciate them, but by superficial, they can exist, yes, but there is something more structural that gardening can transform potentially, which is basically it is about private properties, how we can use institutional frameworks that already exist, and how we can basically take those frameworks and through associations, through self-organization, we can try to collectively imagine new ways of living. You know what I mean? So it's not so much lifestyle, but it's really how we can make use of things that are already there. So, for instance, if there is this English type of landhold, which is the allotment, which is regulated and is legal, it's private land, but it's let out for nothing. You pay £100 per year for half an acre of land. No, it's a lot. It's great. In London, how can you do that? So this is an institutional framework that is available, and that architects and other people can actually take that and try to see what they can do within that institutional framework. So how they can work operatively within that institutional framework. You know what I mean? So, but then in that sense, the question of solitude and togetherness, the question of individuality and collectivism also becomes very important, because it's not easy to self-organize. It's not easy to share land. It's not easy to come up with these models. Because of course, how can we are not educated? No, we are born and raised within a neoliberal society. We are not very used to reconcile our individual interests or whatever we understand individuality with collectivism. It's very hard. I mean, in theory, it makes perfect sense. Because it does, but in practice, we are not used to do it. So in that sense, gardening, when I say gardening could be taken as a collective ritual, in that sense that gardening can come in, not as a way for us to educate ourselves. I don't mean to put it in reactionary terms. I think it can actually become really a way through which groups of people can truly self-organize. So it's almost like, in the beginning of the presentation, I talked about how space can become really like a score, for groups of people to remember how to practice the ritual, it's about memory as well. Gardening also can become first the motive, the reason for people to get together, and do something in common. But from there, once that organization and once that collective body has kind of established itself, from there they can actually branch out and do other things. You know what I mean? So that's why I said that gardening can be the stepping stone for people to do something in common. So I will be more clear. In for example, the allotment. Yes, in an allotment site here in London, the only thing you can do over there is to garden. It wouldn't allow you to do anything else apart from gardening. Well, but perhaps slowly within the existing legal framework in place, maybe associations could try, to slowly and maybe by associating themselves with community land trusts, for instance, and other institutional frameworks, they could try to, even though they can only garden in an allotment site, they could gradually try to form a network of people doing things together around the city, around the urban territory, and then, and maybe try to become self-sufficient. Of course, it would take decades, but it is one of those processes in which we know that, they won't be possible unless architecture becomes a device, a spatial device that enables these people to organize, to do things together, to, and even to actually, see, and localize, identify these spaces within the urban territory, So in a way, all these spaces, they could really perhaps have a form that is easily identifiable, that turn their presence in the urban territory more tangible. So this network becomes visible. I don't know, I'm speculating as well. Does it answer to your question? So that's how I meant, that's exactly how I meant that gardening can transform things more structurally than we can actually imagine.
So in this case, can I understand it like as a degrowth and flexible and sustainable treatment to the this kind of land and for the further development of the society? I mean the idea you expand. I mean the idea I mean it's not like a formal question. It's just like, I mean the whole thing you're talking about, can I understand it as a degrowth and sustainable and flexible treatment to the further development of the society and community, and which creates the harmony and connection between people?
Yes, I agree. I would only highlight that everything I showed, and also my suggestions, my propositions, are never really about society at large. It's perhaps we are talking about, smaller groups of people. So in a sense that we're not thinking about like changing a whole system, a whole country, not even a whole city. It's not about change. It's not about, replacing one thing for another. It's also not about making things better. It's more about enabling willing groups of people, how small they may be, to basically get together and live in an alternative way, perhaps a way that not even themselves are able to know, like it's something that can be collectively built as these people do things together. So it's something more, I know it sounds less ambitious, but it's perhaps more difficult than anything, because you wouldn't count on policies to be changed or laws to be implemented, or we wouldn't count on the government. You can use policies that already exist, but you use them. It's not like you know what I mean? You don't wait for them to be implemented. No, you use whatever you have at hand, and that includes policies. But yeah, it's not about like society. I mean, maybe you use the term loosely, and that's fine. But it's nice that you talk in these terms, so I can kind of stress something that for me is very important. No, it's not about like something total, and it's more about singular groups.
We have a few more questions in the room, but I see there's a raised hand, I think, on the Korean side. So if you would like to ask the question.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for the very amazing lectures. I'm really interested in gardening. Is a really interesting themes to think political and social ritual and forms as a counterpart of architecture, which is really interesting. And especially, I have one question about the second Miguel's project. I think Miguel designed the garden as an individual part with a family, but I think gardening is quite interesting topic to think ambivalence design, I think. So how did Miguel design or control of not architectural form, more like flexible way of systems? How did you design it? Because we all the time having trouble with how to design control nowadays. So that's why I want to get some kind of understanding or learning what he did. Yeah, at the time. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. I'm really glad to join you, and I'm also very happy to hear that you enjoyed the lecture. Yes. So the question is about how Miguel has designed.
Yes.
Yeah. So he was, like I said, he would detail a lot of elements. For instance, this one, no, the shed for the trash bins and the compost toilet. He would actually think about all of these details within the housing unit. But he was very much interested in the notion of the type. So not typology, but the type. And so for him, the housing type was actually a garden type. So it is not that he was thinking, okay, we have a house, now let's think about the garden. No, he would think both of them together. And I didn't include this in the presentation, but he had written a manifesto which had this slogan, what was it called? No housing building without garden building. So he would actually consider gardening as something essential to the idea of dwelling, not essential to the housing typology, but essential to the concept of dwelling. And so perhaps this model here, it's not so ideal, but I like the fact that it's abstract enough for us to think about house and garden as one, let's say, architectural question for him. No, that he imagined that the activity, the process of gardening, he called it like a metabolical cycle, but we can also rephrase it as gardening as part of dwelling. No, so and all that dwelling comprises. No, and one thing that I think is really important is the question of maintenance as use. No, we can think of maintenance as something like I don't know, housework. But ultimately, maintenance is use. It's basically is part of how we use space. Is part of how we inhabit space. So, in this sense, the care for the garden for him was also. That's why I said it could be taken as a mode of building, because through the maintenance of the garden, through weeding, through cutting, through changing, putting one plant on the other side because it didn't really like that corner, or by reshaping the ground, by nurturing the soil, digging and digging out, all those things. By transforming the garden, the dweller could potentially transform the space of his own house. So that's why I think he think about the type. No, he thought about the type and not so much about the typology. And if you look at his schemes for settlements, he uses the same type, even though there are variations. It is again the same housing type that he's investigating over and over again. It's this type in which the garden and the house are taken as just one sort of building.
Thank you. And thank you very much. And also, I have one comment, maybe answering the Rogan's question, maybe with Olivia's answer, I think. And the very important thing is gardening is collective ritual, and the first step things to gather people. So in a way, I think nowadays, maybe for collective housing or some common places, we need to think about what is the important or crucial things to gather people together. So I think by thinking that, we're gonna maybe produce, we're gonna be designing some kind of certain character or certain property to make a common, I think. So in a way, I think the lecture will tomorrow's lecture about owner community and architectural form will give you some kind of hints, because they are sharing or they are doing together so many things, not just gardening. So maybe you can get a little bit sense of tomorrow's lecture, maybe by comparing or by connecting Olivia's lecture today, I think. Yeah.
Wonderful.
There was another question in the room, so we'll take it here.
Thank you very much. I think it's really, really interesting, this notion of ownership and the kind of individual ownership versus the collective ownership. And I think that's something that is somehow essential to the idea of gardening, and is actually people try and challenge it nowadays a lot through community gardens, which actually, in my mind, this an ideology that is failing to some extent. I mean, if you look at the ways in which people, first of all, make community gardens versus the ways that gardens are provided to the individual of their own home. One is, like, as Miga quite kind of clearly points out, the garden is first and foremost prescribed as an equivalent to the house, not even side by side, but as one thing, right? And that is sold as a product, that is your land, you're buying that. And then the community garden is something which is more or less claimed from a sort of like invariably like a disused plot or brownfield site or something. And then more than often they are neglected and, they're not cared for in the same way that a privately owned garden would be or is most of the time. And I think it raises an interesting kind of friction between, so the allotment is really occupies this space exactly in between these two kind of conditions, where you have this idea of collectivity, you have the collectivization of the individual, but the boundaries between those plots are so blurred that it's, a lot of the time people don't even express their boundary between their allotment plots. And yet they care about it because it is theirs. And I think this is where the act of collectivization it's like a make or break moment in a way. So there's a thing being done kind of recently within the past 5 years, I think, in Todmorden in the north in Yorkshire. And it's called Edible Todmorden. And basically it's people going around turning small pockets of space in the town into various kind of bits of garden. And it sort of links to a bit what Logan and a couple other people were saying about how do we think about this idea of self-sufficiency? And it's not trying to achieve self-sufficiency. What they're doing, they're basically providing essentially grazing spots so that you can travel through the urban fabric and graze occasionally. And those spaces are gardened by volunteers. But ultimately, they're not striving for complete self-sufficiency, as also like you pointed out before that, that generally, even with allotment holders, you don't really do that. But I think it's just interesting to try and think about what we do. Like, why should we be trying to push this kind of commoning method? Is it viable? And why should this collective act of gardening actually become such a kind of high standing on the agenda, when it's quite obvious, to me at least, that people really adore their own space, actually. You know, if you look at the way that people garden on their balconies, the way that people try and claim land, even when people make community gardens, it's them claiming land. It's like an ownership of that. And they're probably not actually like buying it. They'll be leasing it or whatever. They'll be granted it, but it's like they go back there because it's important to them. So gardening is also inherently, you know, an individual, quite inward looking act, you know, however, very often done together. But in the end, it's a lot about just your ownership, you're carving out your own space somehow. And this theme of sort of spreading it uniformly across the city, which is being done kind of in many different examples around the world. I'm not sure if it actually enhances people's respect for the act of gardening, actually. In any sense, you could argue that it actually flattens it, and it kind of detaches value from that. I think value is very often derived from people having their own plot, and they treasure it, don't they? But if you made it incredibly uniform, I'm not sure. I mean, it'd be really interesting to see. But typically, in my recollection, those places always fall into sort of dismay and neglect somehow. But I just wonder about what your thoughts are on this kind of tangential, I mean, not the tangential, so this kind of friction between the kind of the private land ownership and this collective notion. Yeah.
Thank you for your question.
Yeah, thanks. I didn't get to show, but there's a more contemporary history of community gardens and also London allotment gardens that includes examples that are a bit more interesting than what I showed. I showed, the very prototypal first allotment gardens in London because I was interested in this ambivalence of these projects. That these were conservative projects. They were imagined and also proposed by, the Bishop of London, so they were not really projects by the working class. No, they were projects by philanthropists for the working class. So from the outset, and not throughout, but from the outset, they were conservative. They had a very reactionary agenda in mind, which was to basically, pacify the working class and to discipline it. So, and even to this day, we can even argue that, the allotment gardening has become a hobby, and many people who can cultivate them, other people living close to these lands. So not exactly the people who actually need to produce food to eat, many of these people live in a terrace with a garden of their own, but they still go to the allotment site for the character it also provides, and to be part or to feel part of a group, and so on. Now, your question/comment was very interesting and also very complex. So I would try to kind of grasp what I remember. Yes, so there are more exciting examples that I didn't show. For instance, the community gardens established by communities from the Caribbean in London, in Uxbridge, and also further south in the city. And these gardens are much more interesting, and also their history, it's a bit less controversial for sure than the ones I showed. But here the focus was ambivalence, then you get the picture. and also in the US, for instance, and maybe in Rome, well, we could talk about Rome. Rome also has a really long history of allotment gardening established by the working class on the periphery of the city, mostly on idle land. Also in Germany and Poland, you can often see what we can call rogue gardens in between viaducts. This leftover land that nobody really knows. We know they belong to the state vaguely, but we don't really know who maintains them. And so they're up for grabs in a way, but not in terms of land ownership, but use. So you talked about this, no? I think use plays a great role. Use/maintenance play a really great role in how people reclaim space. So basically, communities and associations, I think their struggle is not really about the ownership of the land, no? It is more about the right to use the land. This is also what common land, not the commons, but common land is about in England, no? Since ancient times. Common land has always been owned privately, by the bishop, by the lord of the manor, and so on. But what is really crucial about that land is that due to customs and later due to the law, people would have the right to use that land, will have the right to roam, the right to do, lots of things over there. And perhaps this is very powerful because if in one way it's very difficult to challenge private property, no? I mean, what does the Queen represent? The Queen represents private property, no? That's the true power of the royal family, no? So, and it's also the true power of the state in a way. Police exists to protect private property, no? It's the essence of the status quo. So if in one way it might seem very difficult or extremely, let's say, bloody to try to challenge that, we can actually hold on the notion of use and maintenance and then cultivation to try to, find maybe an alternative path. And in that sense, so for instance, you talked about self-sufficiency. Yes, it would be wonderful if these gardens were completely self-sufficient, but if they're not, I think that's okay. Because it is really about reclaiming land through use. And in the process, people actually, bonding and also, understanding that, an association of gardeners can really become, they can become this group that also help each other, that is able to find its own voice, that it's able to negotiate with local authorities, that builds up some power. And because these people, they get together by themselves, it's not something like the state is trying to, here for you, here's something you can use. No, because it all happens somehow spontaneously. I hate that word, but it happens with some degree of self-will. They are truly important, and if these gardens look beautiful or not, I wouldn't worry about that. I think it's more about the process, the process of reclaiming through use, and also keep in mind that these gardens, I think they would be equally genuine and legit if people were going there to do absolutely nothing, which is, of course, not possible in London allotments because associations, they make it very clear as a rule that plot holders must keep growing. Their plot cannot look idle. But, then again, that's ambivalent, because at one hand, it feels very reactionary. I mean, how come? I should, doing nothing, it's important, But at the same time, I totally understand their concern. They need this land to look, active. Otherwise, they will lose their lease, because the council can then, for instance, if the land is leased by the council can basically come and say, "Oh, no. We will take this land away from you, because you know what? There's a public development for housing or for hospital or whatever, looking for land. And we can basically let this land for them instead of you, because basically you're not using it after all." So you see, the question of use is extremely political. And it's really at the heart of the struggle for the city, for the right to the city, to use David Harvey's words.
I mean, so therefore, in a very negative, well, not really, maybe not, point of view, resilience is best embodied through private ownership, actually. If you're trying to resist development, you're trying to resist precarity, then owning something that no one else can touch, which is the way that the world often works now, is actually pretty good in an unfortunate way. That people who are fortunate enough to be living in Georgian terraced houses in South London, for example, with a lovely big garden, they're not going anywhere because they're also listed as well. And I just wonder if there's a way that we can approach that collectivity within that private framework. Yeah. Because it just seems like a struggle in perpetuity otherwise.
Absolutely, you gave the answer. I do agree. And here at the AA, we have a great wealth of diploma projects speculating on that possibility, of course. Within the framework of private property, is also possible to rebel. Absolutely. And then the garden can be a means to do that. And I wouldn't go as far to say that was behind Miguel's proposition. We cannot say that. But we can take his projects and take a step further and say, no, look, or even Karel Teige's projects in thinking of minimal dwelling. And we can say, no, look, it's within the home. I mean, not necessarily private property, no, it's within the home. So within the private, in the sense of individual, no, an interior realm of the home, it's possible to rebel, absolutely. And I would say that it might be the case that, I mean, maybe we could think of a project in which both realms, no, the realm of collectivism outside the home and rebellion inside the home, they coexist. Absolutely, they should coexist.
Just checking if there's any more questions from the Korean side or anyone else online. Okay. Anybody else? Okay, no more questions here either. So I think that we could end this session. Thank you so much, Olivia, and everyone else, we'll see you tomorrow.